So you built, obviously, built in Atlanta. It was the early days of Atlanta. Can you talk about what Atlanta was like to build a technology company when you started Pardot?
At the time, Atlanta had all the ingredients to build a great startup scene. And we had some fits and starts. At the time, I kid you not, there was one single angel investor in the whole city. There was only one person who was writing angel checks, which is insane for, being one of the 10 largest metro regions in the country.
Who was that? Sig and that?
Yeah. And he had a few others that if he would write the check, they would follow on. But if he didn't write the check, they weren't writing the check. I mean, it was tough going from a startup community. But in terms of a city having amazing ingredients to build a startup scene, having Georgia Tech, one of the best engineering schools in the country, big engineering school, tons of amazing talent that comes to Atlanta. 40% of Georgia Tech students come from out of state to Atlanta. Having Emory's, one of the best schools in the country. The majority of the Emory students come from out of state to Atlanta. And then, of course, having, all the big city amenities, the world's busiest airport. So direct flights all over the world. Having a great climate, being in the South, so we don't have to worry about snow or any of those kinds of things. And then just having a lot of infrastructure, having a full heavy rail system, having the mountains be an hour away, having, miles and miles of all kinds of trails and everything else from a quality of life. And then having the big city amenities like the pro sports teams and the big concert venues and on and on. So ingredient wise, Atlanta had all the pieces, including the secret ingredient. And that secret ingredient is and was Georgia Tech, right? You just need a lot of great technical talent to complement the business people and the entrepreneurs and everything else that goes on. And so back then, the community was pretty small, but thankfully there were all the ingredients just sitting there. And so even in the latter days of Pardot, in an effort to help grow the startup community, one of the things that we were working on was an office space expansion. We had about 30,000 square feet in Atlanta Plaza when we sold the business, but we had a lease that was ready to be signed where we were going to take over the 6,000 square feet of space in the same building that used to house the Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. So there used to be a fancy steakhouse in our building. They had moved to a building nearby, and so we had this big restaurant space, tall ceilings, big windows, just beautiful 6,000 square feet. And so when we sold the business, we actually had a lease on the table that was ready to be signed to rent out the 6,000 square feet of retail space in our building. We were on the 34th floor and the 33rd floor, and we were going to make that 6,000 square feet. It was going to be Atlanta's first co-working space for startups.
I didn't know that.
And it was, beautiful space. Of course, when we sold the business, ExactTarget's like, no way, we're not signing a 10-year lease on 6,000 feet just to help startups in Atlanta. But the wheels were already in motion that like, wow, there's so many great ingredients in Atlanta. Atlanta having a lot of sprawl, being a big metro region, startups were all over the place. There was a little pocket down by Georgia Tech. And outside of that pocket around Georgia Tech, there was really no other pocket in Atlanta that had some critical mass. And so sold the business in October. And then by November, a month and a half later, we were under contract to buy a 100,000 square foot building. And we were building, 100,000 square foot building in Buckhead and, a full floor for event space and coffee shop and community center, and then 4 full floors for startups. And so we closed on that right after Christmas of that year. So we went from selling the business mid-October, under contract on 100,000 square foot mid-rise, but a serious mid-rise, a big one. And then, open for business Jan 1, just a couple months later. And so that was the Atlanta Tech Village. And, it's really taken on a life of its own. At the time, the original goal was, hey, we're going to take 2 floors, we're going to renovate it, make it super cool. We're going to do a big event space and a coffee shop, and we're going to make it the place for startups in Atlanta. And then on the, Jan 1, I took my 2 little kids at the time, and we went to IKEA to outfit the second floor. The second floor was completely 100% empty. It was an old law firm that had moved out years before. And so it was a bunch of offices and conference rooms, but no furniture. And so I took my 2 little kids to IKEA, and we spent $40,000 on IKEA furniture. So if you've ever been to IKEA, like, it's hard to spend 40 grand. You know, it's like $100 desk and $100 chair. But we had 1 floor of a 5-story building. So we had 20,000 square feet to fit out. And so we bought the IKEA furniture, had a giant assembly party. You know, it's not fun putting IKEA stuff together. I've done it many times. But by the end of that first week of January, we had rented out the entire second floor in the building. There was so much pent-up demand for entrepreneurs that wanted a private office to be headquarters, to have a membership, to work in a co-working space, to have a community around them, just to be with other entrepreneurs. And so by the end of that first week, I knew that there was even more pent-up demand than I had hoped for entrepreneurs to be around each other. And so we immediately started a process to renovate the whole building all at once, instead of just doing a little bit up front. And so we spent 2 years, renovated the entire building, interior and exterior. And that was over 10 years ago. And so now we've had over 2,000 startups in the course of the last 13 years come through the building. We've had tons of amazing exits like SalesLoft, and tons of amazing secondaries and fundraising announcements like Calendly.